They laughed when he built inverted houses across the village, and the laughter sat in the mouths of people like hard candy that wouldn't dissolve. Silas Carter watched them laugh from the rim of his own doorway, the laugh curling with the smoke from his hearth and drifting out into the sharp air. He could see Amos Reed's first curved roof below the slope, a dark half-egg pressed into the hill, smoke climbing like a pale promise through a narrow flue. Pine and birch stood white and still beyond. Children's breath hung like small clouds over the yard. The world smelled of cold and char, and the village, for all its jokes, had never felt so exposed. Silas had been raised where wood was the currency of comfort. He knew the long rustle of a stacked pile, the sharp, dry assurance of a cord split and stacked under tarps, the way a well-tended fire made a house seem like a thing alive. Yet for years the wind found its way into every seam of their frame cabins. Drafts threaded the nights, and men swore at joints, at the thinness of roofs, at the way snow would sit on eaves and slip, bringing ice to hang and grind in the gutters. Stories of better-built places drifted in with traders at Morgan's Fork, and most men folded those stories away like maps they could never afford. Amos Reed came with a different sort of map. He spoke of earth like a blanket, and of the way a curve could catch heat, the way a cupped hand catches rain. He bent his words the way he bent his ribs of seasoned wood. Careful, patient, not loud enough to jab, but enough to make people look up from their chopping. He called them inverted houses, arched, earth-sheltered homes that leaned into the ground instead of pushing away from it. The name made the children giggle and the elders frown. "Looks like a bearing place for eggs," Old Man Hallett had said once, slapping his knee. "Not a house." Amos laughed it off with the easy grin that had kept him from being scorned outright. Mercy Reed, his partner, moved among the skeptics with a warm bowl and a long-armed calm that steadied more than one temper. She did not argue. There was a steadiness about Amos that could be mistaken for stubbornness, but was in truth a kind of faith in craft. He had been a joiner and a tinkerer long before he ever spoke of houses, and when he talked about steaming wood until it bent, or laying grass mats like a skin, he spoke as a man who had wrestled with other stubborn things and won. Silas found himself walking to Amos's first house the morning the ground had its first frost. Jake, the boy with a crown of unruly hair, trailed after him, cheeks burned by the cold. Clara moved quietly inside her apron pocket the small pin of grain she kept for the family. Tom came too, his hands already calloused, his mind on how a curve might change the way he framed a beam. Eliza put on a thicker shawl and watched them from the threshold for a long time before she tucked the kettle to the fire and followed. They worked without much ceremony. Silas remembered how Amos chose the ribs, long, steamed, and coaxed until they would take a gentle bow like a willow under snow. He did not explain the swelling or the rightness of one piece over another beyond the plain things. The wood must be honest, the soil must be friendly, and the structure must be tied to the land, not merely set upon it. Men hammered, women tamped clay into cracks, children stacked grass in neat, careless bundles and learned to lay mats as if they were learning a prayer. There were small humiliations to the work. Ribs snapped, hands blistered. A night came when the first attempt sagged under its own weight, and half the men had to sleep under an improvised tarp while Amos and Silas took stock by lantern. They muttered and measured in the soft language of men who repair things, the tilt of a peg, the slackness of a lash. Eliza brought bread and a cupped hush that made the men gentler with one another. Mercy brought broth that tasted of marrow and a room stillness that felt like forgiveness. The building became a kind of congregation. Neighbors who had never been in each other's houses began to gather on the slopes. They shared tools, then stories, then laughter that was less cruel and more tentative. Abigail Oakes brought rawhide strips and an eye for binding. Hiram Oakes, who had hands like knotty roots and who fixed anything from a sled to a stubborn plow, lent his shoulder when a rib needed bending the last inch. Eli Walker, steady in a young man's way, learned to climb the slick, curved sides and hold a line. Buck and Juniper, the horses, stood patient at the edge of the work, and the dog Bran kept a careful watch that made the children feel safe. "Will they hold?" more than one asked, and the question was not meant only for the wood. It asked whether humility would hold up against stubborn habit, whether new thinking could survive when winter came to test both idea and man. Silas, who had learned to read weather in the way his barn cats read mice, believed the houses had merit. They hugged the earth, and that was a good start. Heat, he knew, liked company. To be surrounded by soil was to be offered the cold's opposite. He had no illusions. A curved roof did not mean warmth without labor. The houses demanded careful chinking, constant tending of smoke channels, and a discipline about doors and drafts that was different from the old ways. They also asked for labor the village could scarcely spare. "Help me with the tamping," Amos would say, and the men, reluctant but curious, would come. They learned not from a diagram but from the feel of hands on sod, from the sound the ground made when it was firm enough, from the smell of peat pressed into hollow. It was work that taught patience. It taught the kind of humility that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with staying with the hard part until it was finished. By the time snow stitched the trees and the first real bite of winter settled in, the village had 3 of the arched houses. One stood like a beached shell at the edge of Silas's property. Another had been set into the lee of Mercy's soil patch. The third, Amos's first, had stars of ice on its flue. The rest of the settlement still lived in framed cabins with straight lines and creaky roofs. Mockery had not evaporated. Old grudges ran like hidden roots in people who distrusted change. But there was curiosity. People paused more often when they passed the curved homes, and children, ever more honest than their parents, slipped close and peered in, delighted to find the air inside softer, like a palm. Silas noticed, too, a change in the way wood was counted. Where men once boasted of the neatness of their stacks, they began to glance at the yard under the eaves where logs were kept. Women lined up cloth sacks by the hearth, measuring the days by slender ribbons of flour, but the count of wood hung over the household like a dark thought. He and Eliza tightened their rules. They burned only what needed burning. They slept with doors closed and urged the children to play with games that kept hands and spirits as warm as possible. The payoff arrived not in a triumphant single night, but in a slow unfolding of small proofs. When a late thaw and then a quick freeze brought a sheet of ice to the lane, the breath inside the arched houses did not run into a whistle. A woman from the opposite ridge, who had kept a framed house since her marriage, came to borrow first light and stood with her palms on Amos's bench, where the smoke flue crept like a sinew along the wall. She left without the borrowed light, a softened expression making room on her face where skepticism had been. "You lose less heat when the roof doesn't make a corner to call wind," Amos said once, but he did not say it like a man who had showed up with an answer. He said it like a man who had been asked to solve a puzzle, and the puzzle had yielded. Word spread in a way that laughter had never managed. Men who had grumbled about Amos's odd dream began to lend axe and rope. They traded in small certainties, a cord of wood for an afternoon's work, a bag of salt for a morning of tamping. The village found itself doing what settlements always did in times of pressure, pooling what was scarce and trading labor like currency. A common woodpile was set up along the communal path under a lean-to that kept the pile from sopping in rain, and a ledger, a rough scratch in a plank, recorded who had taken what and who had given. Silas watched this change with a measured pride. He felt it most in how his children grew. Clara, who had been quick to help the women, stood taller and more assured when she tied a grass mat. Jake, who could not bear to see a thing unfinished, learned to step back and let a plan settle before he charged in. Tom, practical and hands-on, began to draw shapes in the dirt the way a farmer draws furrows, thinking not only of crops but of shelter shaped to meet the land. Eliza, who kept the family's small world steady, used the warmth that came from the arched stove to dry herbs and sew, with a diligence that made the house sing in small ways. Some proofs were humbler than others. A night of blizzard came up from the plains and lasted 3 days. The framed cabins hissed and grumbled in the ice. Kettles sang thinly as wood was coaxed into steady fires. In the arched houses, people closed doors and felt the warmth spread slow and even as a spill of honey. They did not boast. They sat together and watched the white press against the small windows and felt in their bones a quiet satisfaction, like the satisfaction of mending a fence before the hogs fell into the neighbor's field. It was a vindication that did not shout. It merely fixed a place in people's memories. The village began to build more. Amos taught with hands and few words. The technique was not new in the world, but in a place that had always raised straight lines and square corners, the curve carried a small scandal. Mercy organized the women to weave grass mats and prepare thatch. Men who had never worked together beyond trading wood began to stand in a line and pass sod like a slow, living chain. The act of building made a community of them, tying them together with the muscle memory of shared labor. "You'll be glad for it when the hard frost comes," Hiram told a man who had been slow to help. "You will be, whether you like Amos or not." Yet the real trial had not yet come. Winter has ways of testing more than a roof. It finds the gaps in plans and in people. It forces hard choices out into the open and measures the steadiness of a man's hands against the cold and the hunger. The first sign was small and cunning. The spring that had fed the village trickled scant and then ran thinly in a sickly whisper. That spring had always obliged, even in lean years. Folk spoke of it like a neighbor who was dependable if given a little kindness. That winter it decided to gang up with the cold. Ice crept into its throat. A thin crust sealed the mouth of the channel. What water came was stained with a blue that said, "Frozen." The men stooped and listened and set pots at the lip. They dug at the edge and found ice like teeth. Mercy boiled shredded bark for warmth, and the children watched with an impatience that made their cheeks go chapped and bright. Then came a night of wind that had a cruelty all its own. It arrived like a stranger who has studied a house plan for days and knows exactly where the skeleton is weakest. Snow piled in pockets and formed drifts that sat like sleeping beasts against sides and corners. Ice formed along eaves and pulled at shingles. On the north side of the oak's roof an ice dam took hold, a rope of frozen water that hung heavy and insistent, and for all their bands and lashings a section of the arched eave sagged under the weight. Silas was jarred awake by the sound of a groan that was not human. It was the house complaining, a long wooden earth moan. He could smell damp in the air where it should not have been. He dressed and wrapped his hands in cloth and slid out into a world varnished in silver. He could see the dim shape of Hiram on a ladder that leaned against an eave, Eli below, handing lines. They were both as white as their horses. The light from the flue was a warm speck in the dark. Above it, snow and ice pressed like a weight. "We'll have to shore it from inside," Hiram called, his breath a raw hiss. "Tie ropes to the staves and hold the curve." They worked like men who had done this before, balancing on roofs with rawhide bindings and beckoning to the earth. Bran circled below and barked, ears pricked. Silas felt his stomach contract around a single thought: the woodpile. If the spring failed, and then the wood was buried under drift or ruined by thaw, then all the neat proof of the arched houses might dry up like a lesson that hadn't taken. They made the repairs with a care that was more fear than skill. Hands were numb and clumsy. Amos, high up and quiet in his concentration, cut and pressed and listened to the house as if it spoke in splinters. The work was not elegant. It was brutal and intimate and necessary. They hauled snow away from the flue and saw the bench where smoke crept along the wall. They wrapped and layered, tucked and sealed. They sang no songs. Songs would have been a poor companion to the cold air. Instead they measured by the slow tasks done, and the lines held firm. That night they discovered the woodpile down by the wooded ridge had been partially buried in a drift and half ice stiff. Much of the outer layer was still sound, but the men who had been saving for the long season found their fingers on a small, serious fear. Food was being rationed quietly, extra fat reserved for the very cold nights, and the count of days pressed close to each household like a hand. At the council that evening, a patchwork of men with caps and women with shawls, voices were low and the choices were not sweet. The ledger on the common plank listed what was owed, who had given, who had yet to pay back. Morgan's Fork, where the trader Morgan ran a rough store of goods and where a sled of supplies could be begged, stood 3 days' ride into open country. It was a distance measured not only by miles but by the temperament of winter. Riders could make it or not. Horses could find their way or falter. There were wolves along the ridge in lean times, and tracks told of their boldness. The village could not keep going on borrowed heat and hope. "We can't send everyone," Silas said, because it seemed a right thing to say. "We need a handful, good hands and steady horses." Amos sat quiet in the corner, his palms folded the way a man folds when he isn't sure whether to say anything. Mercy tucked her fingers into the hem of her skirt and kept her eyes on the floor. Hiram's knuckles showed white. Eli's jaw set like a plank. "Who goes?" asked Abigail, practical as ever. She always asked what must be asked. Who takes the risk when every man has the same need? Hiram was smoky-eyed and ready. Eli, the younger, had the look of a man who had been chosen for steadiness. They both had horses. Buck, who had been through winters that left him scarred but true. Juniper, a mare who could find the faintest scent of fur beneath drag and frost. Silas hesitated. He thought of his own family, of Eliza's steady hands and Jake's laugh that chased the dark out of the house like light chasing away mice, but he also knew he could not reason his way out of the simple arithmetic. If no one rode, they all risked running out of salt, of flour, of oil for lamps. If someone went and failed, the consequences were immediate and raw. In the end, the choice was pragmatic. Hiram went because he had the experience and the right stubbornness. Eli went because he did not know himself yet enough to be afraid. They wrapped up what they could: a few sacks, a length of rope, a measure of dried beans. Bran paced and whined, sensing the county of risk. The horses breathed clouds that lifted and thinned in the cold. Before they left, Amos came to Silas and offered something not of goods, but of care. He pressed his hand to the bench inside Silas's house and spoke in a voice that was softer than the man usually used. "Watch the side lids," Amos said, meaning the small openings that could invite a draft. "When the wind starts to change, you will know. Close them early." Silas wanted to ask about the bench flue, about drainage channels he had seen Amos sketch in the dirt, but he bit back questions that would have become lists of tasks. Amos did not do lists, he did small, decisive touches. It was in the doing that he taught. The village sent them off with hands on shoulders and no hollow bravado. Eliza tied a small leather pouch containing a pinch of salt to Hiram's bridle. Jake pressed a worn toy into Eli's jacket. Silas watched as horses moved away from the path like ghosts and then were swallowed by the white. For a long while the only sound was the scrape of a boot and the soft whine of the wind. He felt every step the riders took as if it were his own heart being wrapped in cold. As the riders became little more than a smudge on the horizon and then nothing, the village turned the labor inward. They took stock with a pragmatic thoroughness born of need. Coal and wood were counted again. Pots were measured to yield smaller stews. Children were given games that conserved energy, whispering contests, quiet storytelling by the short light of the embers. Bran kept his watch at the edge of the clearing, as if he could keep the sky from falling by barking. Storms have a way of accentuating the smallness of human plans. They reveal the thin places. In the days after the riders left, the wind returned in a more learned, deliberate fashion. It found seams in places that had not been thought weak. The arched houses, for all their virtue, demanded attention. Earth will cling and melt and refreeze in ways that are not kind to men who assume a roof is a roof. Amos and Silas went from house to house, buttressing where necessary, sealing where a gap showed its teeth. One night, after a day of mending and pressing snow from flues, Silas walked to the hollow where Amos's first house stood. The night air bit with the kind of cold that makes your face ache in a personal way. The stars were opaque, the moon a pale coin behind a veil. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth. It was colder than the inside, yes, but beneath the crust there was a slow, almost unnoticeable warmth that steadied him. He thought then of all the small labors of the last months that hung together like a net. He felt the village as much as he smelled it, the low cadence of other fires, the muffled thumps of animals in round pens, the distant snickering bushes that had once seemed indifferent. It would be easy, he told himself, to take pride. It would be foolish to mistake pride for achievement. They had not yet passed the truer test, the deep freeze that could last for weeks, for the sudden melt that could wash away their stores, for wolves that travel on the bones of winter. Yet in the quiet, with Bran's breath making tiny clouds and the child's toy left on the stoop like an oath, Silas allowed himself a small confidence. The houses worked, not completely, not effortlessly, but in a way that gave him room to breathe. The first part of the winter bent toward its middle when word came that made every man pause. The road to Morgan's Fork was measured to be worse than remembered. Tracks showed that wolves had been seen near the low passes, and that a drift too deep might stop a sled cold. The ledger's scratches seemed to suddenly curl into unconcerned questions. Rationing became a list of things that needed to be done sooner rather than later. The village gathered wood from outlying deadfalls. They traded a loaf for an axe handled by a skilled hand. Amos and Silas devised small improvements, channels in the eaves to guide melt, small raised seats near the hearth to keep cooking away from the damp earth. Each improvement was tentative, respectful of the house's needs, yet practical in the way a man patches a coat. Then the sea-sky night arrived. Snow came down as if the world had decided to unmake itself. It began as a hush, almost polite, and then it became fierce. The wind angled and then changed minds, coming up the valley in a way that forced the drifts into the lanes like the hands of giants rearranging furniture. Visibility shrank until the flue lights might have been stars. People stayed put in their houses and listened. The framed cabins creaked and complained. The arched roofs, for all their merit, groaned under the new pattern of load. Inside his house, Silas could hear the work of the village play out as a music of tasks. Children were told stories in low voices. Eliza moved between the rooms like a small, sure tide, dispensing boiled tea and dry cloth. The house kept a steady hearth, and they felt the warmth as a ribbon that tied them together. But he thought of the riders out there in that weather. He thought of horses forced to navigate a white that had no mercy for sound. He put on his coat and stood at the small window until his face burned and his breath fogged the glass. The next morning it was worse. The lane was gone. The world had collapsed into a single, undifferentiated white. The ridge where the common pile stood was a mound of wind and ice. Abigail walked with a careful step to the pile and found her hands shoveling not wood but a hard crust that lay like cake. She dug in pride and found beneath the surface some usable pieces, but there was much lost to the freeze. Slender, invisible decisions had become manifest. Who would have enough to tide them through the next 10 days? How they would keep the animals fed? Whether the horses would hold. "Send a man to Morgan's still," someone said, and there was the old bitter taste in their mouths, the ride that had been made, the uncertainty that had followed. But Hiram and Eli had gone. Would they return? There was no way to know for certain. The village shifted then, not into panic, but into a kind of focused, grim business. Men hauled what they could of the lean wood into shared houses, and Amos organized a rota that put young men on watch for wolves and frost that might lift an eave. They knotted rawhide to rods and tightened lines. They made decisions of economy, choosing whether to burn the thick boards or save them. The children learned the look of hunger in a way that is cruel and immediate, not tormenting but quiet, an attention turned inward to counting the bites of bread like precious things found under a stone. Silas found himself back on Amos's stoop the day before the riders were meant to return. He thought of the arched roofs, the way the earth wanted to slip and hold, the way a house could be a living thing if you gave it attention. He thought, too, about how easily one could be proven wrong. The laughter that had greeted Amos's first bent roof now echoed faintly in his memory like a child's jeer, but it had been softened into something else, a curious respect that was not yet steady. That evening they prepared a small signal, a sheet tied to a pole like a flag, and a hand-held lantern. It was not much, but it was a sign that a village could hold to its hope. The children were hushed into bed, and Jake placed his small wooden toy on the sill, as if offering it to the road. Eliza put her hand on Silas's forearm and said nothing, and that silence said everything he needed to know. Fear was there, thin as ice, but it was accompanied by the work of keeping each other. When the wind changed in the pre-dawn hours, it did more than blow. It carried with it the first cries of the sentinel dogs and the dull, distant thumps that men know too well. A hoof slipped, a harness creaked, a shout quickly swallowed by the white. Silas pulled on his coat, though he had nowhere to go he could reach in time. He went outside and found the world remade, the shapes of houses reduced to lumps, flues like chimney lights, the horse's breath hanging like small clouds. From the ridge a shape loomed, brothers of the white, or perhaps human, a blur that resolved into a horse, and then two. Hiram and Eli came back like figures born of wind. Their faces showed the world had been hard on them, noses chapped and raw, lines carved like new furrows. They had no easy triumph to show. They had bread and flour and little else. They had been tested enough. Behind them the horses stumbled, their flanks flecked with frost, but they were there. Relief rose up, and then they set about counting. They counted in sober tones, measuring what would go to the village stores and what would stay with the riders. They spoke of the trail as men who had narrowly beaten a closing door. They spoke of wolves sighted near Morgan's Fork in numbers that made the skin crawl. They said other things in quiet, about trails gone, about drifts unmapped, about the thin mercy of horses who had found footing where none had been thought to be. Silas felt the village exhale like a lung that had been held for too long. But the exhale was not an end. It was a contraction that made room for the next hard breath. They had made it through one trial. That was real. It did not mean other trials would cease. That night the arched houses smelled softer than the framed ones, not only because of the way smoke cradled in the flue, but because of the work and the pieces of life that had been saved. Children slept with a faint luxury of warmth. Adults sat and mended and planed and made small improvements. Amos moved among them in the dusk, his hands never idle. Mercy took in the children and smoothed their hair. Silas, who had held the village's practical anxieties on a string like some small bell, felt a tenderness he had no name for. It sat in his chest and brightened his sense of what this place could be. In the hush before dawn, as snow sifted like pale flour over the world, he stepped outside and looked over the little settlement. The inverted roofs rose like a syntax he had only recently learned. They had been mocked, they had been tested. They had not yet been hailed, nor had they solved everything. But they had begun to change what it meant to keep warm when winter came with hunger on its breath. Silas thought of the long season ahead and of the choices they had made, and he felt a tiredness that was honest and steady. He knew storms would come again, each with its own way of asking questions he could not yet answer. For now, with Hiram and Eli back and the stores patched and the children quiet, there was a ripeness to a small, shared confidence. "Would you have trusted Amos? Tell us below." The question hung for a moment in the cold like a small lantern. They did not sit idly on newfound luck. Amos's improvements, a shallow drainage channel here, the bench flue adjusted better there, were tested the next week when thaw and freeze conspired to make a new kind of hazard. Snow on the roofs began to melt in the day and then refreeze at night, forming ice that ate at eaves. Where the drainage had been properly laid, the melt slid and away. Where it had not, the ice pooled and darkened and made a throat for rot. Men took to walking the roofs with ropes and rawhide lashings, their feet finding the curve like a sailor finds a steady deck. The work was perilous. Slips were common, and fear a steady companion. Amos did not pretend there was no risk. He only showed that risk could be managed with industry and attentiveness. A week later, a panic ran through the village when a section of the oak's roof threatened to let loose a small avalanche. Hiram and Abigail stood under the eave, shouting countersigns. Silas tied a line and climbed with the steadiness of a man who had often taken on the awkward and the necessary. They worked until the taste of metal and earth filled their mouths, and their hands were numb with cold. They kept the animal pens clear and shifted the stored wood to the community house. When the roof held after hours of steady effort, a hush fell like snow upon snow. It was not a triumph so much as a reprieve, a promise to keep pressing on. In the dim warmth of an evening meal after that labor, the village gathered with an honesty that was new. They ate from a communal pot. Apples had been shaved thin, and the stew tasted of shared sacrifice and a small grace. Amos sat near the hearth and listened more than he spoke. Mercy passed him a bowl, and for once he allowed himself a full, unguarded smile. "Not a miracle," he said at last, and the sentence struck a chord. "Just work and a mind to do it." "That's enough," Silas replied, and the reply was simple, contained, true. In the corner, Jake fell asleep with his head on Eliza's knee, his breath soft like a sachet being filled. Bran curled at the hearth with an eye half open, listening to the world beyond the walls. Outside, the wind argued with the hill, but it had learned a little of the village's endurance. The inverted houses stood, ordered like odd children against the cold, not perfect, not invincible, but tested in small, steady ways that made room for a future shaped by labor and mutual care. And yet, In the mind of Silas, one fact would not be set aside. Winter was deepening. The spring was thin. The woodpile had been salvaged only in part. Wolves had been sighted near Morgan's Fork. Whatever the arched roofs had given them was now braided with new thorned needs. The village had passed a test, but the long season was not won by a single night of survival. It would be won, if it were to be won at all, by the patient stacking of small successes and the sober acceptance of necessary losses. They would go on because they had to. They would mend, ration, and ride out when the trail allowed. Silas walked through the village before dawn and looked at the lines of houses shaped like bent backs, each one a declaration of intent, to press close to the earth and see what shelter might grow from humility and craft. He thought of Amos and Mercy, of Hiram and Abigail, of Eli with the steadiness of his jaw, and of his own wife, who kept their world alive with the simple, stubborn gestures of a woman who knows how to save a family by small economies of care. When the next storm climbed the valley and the snow began to fall, it found a village that had learned a new vocabulary for survival. They had been mocked and then tested and had passed, but not without paying with tired hands and shared sacrifices. The arched roofs still bore the tags of their maker's labor: tamped earth and woven grass, staves bent and lashed, smoke drawn like a thread. They were not a cure-all. They were a shape that invited attendance and respect. Silas went to sleep that night with the sound of the wind like an old record in his ears, and the faint warmth from the bench flew in his bones. He dreamed of buckling snow, of riders wading through white, and of a village that had learned to stand shoulder to shoulder. He did not dream of triumph. He dreamt instead of steady hands and soft meals shared by low light, and of a child whose laughter could be heard even when the wind argued the world into a silence. The morning came with a white intensity that made sight uncertain. Voices carried like muffled bells. Men stepped into the cold and went about the day's hard work. Amos and Silas moved from house to house, checking, sealing, advising. Mercy tended to a child with a fever, and the village bent around her like a good thing. Abigail reported on the stores with a candor that made the worst numbers easier to bear. The ledger spoke the truth without flourish. Then, that afternoon, a new trouble arrived. Not a collapse of roof, but a discovery that changed the ledger's quiet arithmetic. The hidden spring where they had hoped to find water in the thaw had frozen deeper than they thought. A patch of the common fields had heaved and slipped in an overnight frost, overturning a stash of food they'd thought safely buried. The loss was not total, but it was enough to turn a calculation into a crisis. "Hiram and Eli, they're the only ones who could have made this trip and come back with half the goods," someone said. The statement stood in the air like a verdict. People looked at each other in the way people do when a plan needs an executor, and the executor is absent. The village faced the grind of choosing between sending more riders into a weather likely to swallow them and holding what they had and inching forward with thin rations. Silas's hands clenched on the plank he leaned against. He thought of his family and of the arched houses like careful beasts. There was no easy answer. He had learned, in the course of being a father and a builder, that leadership was less about the grand gesture and more about deciding which small, bitter piece to keep. He found himself ready to make that hard choice again, to trust in the men who had gone, or to send another group out while Hiram and Eli were likely still returning. They agreed to wait until dusk to see first if any light would appear on the ridge. The village settled into a waiting that tasted of iron. Children were kept by the fire and told stories to keep their hearts full without burning resources. Brand patrolled the edge with an anxious cadence, and the horses stood in their pens, bellies rumbling like low hunger. Silas walked to Amos's house and found him at the flue adjusting the bench with nimble hands. Amos did not look up when Silas came in. "You were right," Silas said, and the admission was small but heavy. Amos did not smile. "We only get a little right sometimes," he answered. "We keep doing that." Outside, the day shortened without much argument. The sky made a decision to darken, and the snow turned more emphatic. Men moved with a solemnity that felt almost ceremonial. They checked their knots and their rawhide and the sparing of their last flitches. It was the kind of movement that gathered into a resolve. If something had to be done, then it would be done by those who could bear it. Silas went back to his door and looked out across the slope. The ridge was a white lip, honest and cold. He thought of the laughter that had met Amos's first house, and felt in himself a sort of soft apology for those who had mocked. He had not been surprised by the success. He had been surprised that success came at such cost. The arched roofs were not only a change in architecture, they were a change in the villages packed with winter. They demanded more watchfulness, more willingness to mend, and a steadier kind of courage. When the light finally listed at dusk and Hiram and Eli's figures reappeared like the thin ends of a story not yet closed, the village felt its breath loosen a fraction. They had not returned with all that the trader kept at Morgan's Fork. What they had brought were bones of sustenance, enough to stave off immediate collapse if the ration plan was followed with care. They had been shaped by the ride, faces carved, weathered like old rope and eyes that had seen too much sky. Relief moved through the village like a slow tide, practical and wary. They greeted Hiram and Eli with hands that smelled of smoke and salt, and without ceremony they set about the counting that, in cold weather, is the sharpest kind of prayer. They had flour enough for a shorter winter if they were strict. The flour had grit from the road and a faint sweetness of bran that made Eliza tuck a little extra into the children's porridge. There was a sack of beans that would stretch if cooked thin, and a small barrel of salted pork that meant nights could be lived through on thin, rich stews. The oil for lamps was less than hoped for. They would have to make the daylight at dawn and dusk carry farther. Buck and Juniper were worn but sound. One of Hiram's stirrups had cracked on the way back, and Juniper's near shoulder bore a shallow, frozen scrape where she had slipped but not fallen. Bran greeted them as if he had been holding his breath the whole time, circling and bristling until the men laughed at him and a child threw a mitten. The ledger was adjusted with blunt honesty. Rations were planned not as punishment but as a way of keeping the whole village alive. Eliza and Mercy divided tasks so that the elders and the most fevered would be tended, while the able-bodied kept watch on the roofs and the flues. Amos moved through the rooms like a practiced surgeon of shelter, making small changes that were more like reassurance than invention. A wedge here to ease the curve in a failing eave, a pinch of tamped earth there to stop a draft. The work was not glamorous. It was the steady grinding of hands and the careful trade of one discomfort for another. The next storm came like an exam paper shoved at their faces. It was not as fierce as the whiteout that had swallowed the riders, but it was cunning. A slow, wet snow that turned to a crust and threatened the animals with a coat of ice. Wolves pressed circles along the outer woodline, scenting a soft desperation. One night, after they'd banked the hearths for the smallest flame and had gone to sleep with the taste of thin bread on their tongues, Bran woke them all with a savage, single bark that changed the air. Hiram was the first out, followed by Silas and two others. They moved in a careful ring around the pens where the mares and the cart horses huddled. Moonlight turned the world into old tin, and breath clouded like small ghosts. A low ridge of wolves slipped along the tree line, eyes reflecting fire in a way that made even the hard men feel small. The dogs ran and the men made noise and beat at the air. One wolf, bold and white-mottled, broke for Juniper. Hiram threw himself between horse and teeth, a rope in his hand, and the wolf missed by the breadth of a boot. It was close enough that later no one would say how close, only that the horse stamped its foot and stood trembling, and that Juniper's flank had a shallow bruise but would live. They did not chase the wolves far. There was no sport in it. They drove them off with shouting and with light and with the presence of people who would not be easy prey, and then they went back to shore the fences and moved the animals deeper into the lee of houses. The night left them exhausted and raw, but also more certain of one practical truth. Shelter matters, yes, but so does the circle a people keep around what they value. The inverted houses had given them warmth that kept the animals less restless, the bench flue had kept smoke clear and hands dry, and the drain channels had spared some roofs from ice's worst cunning. None of it had been a miracle. It had been method and attentive labor stretched into a web. After those dark nights they worked to make the arched houses better in ways that could be read as little kindnesses. Amos and Silas supervised the laying of more grass mats on a few eaves that had shown weakness, and they dug shallow channels at the lip of the curve where meltwater tended to gather. They did not reinvent the houses. They taught them to do their jobs more clearly. Children were given small, safe tasks close to the hearth, carrying a cup of ash to the garden for melting, passing small pieces of cloth for the bandages. The rhythm of days became a set of careful moves, like a dance learned after many missteps. One afternoon, late in the shallow light of a winter sun, the village gathered in the common house for a meal that felt more like a ceremony than a supper. The stew was thin but aromatic. The apples were fewer than they'd once been, but each slice tasted of the orchard and of a summer that had been stored for dark times. Silas sat at the hearth opposite Amos and watched the room the way a man watches the face of someone he loves. There were marks of the season on everyone's clothes, the fraying of sleeves, the patches on knees, the dirt ground into hems. But there was also a look that had not been there at the start of winter, a kind of hollowed gratitude, a recognition that they had been shown a better way to take care of one another. Amos did not take credit. He stirred his stew and chewed slowly, as if tasting more than food. "They'll laugh again someday," he said softly, and the sentence could have been read two ways. Perhaps he meant that human beings are quick to return to old comforts, quick to scoff at new shapes when the weather is fair. Or perhaps he meant that laughter is a thing that can return after fear, and that it wasn't always mockery. It could be kinship, too. Silas answered simply, and his voice folded into the room like a hand into a glove. "Let them," he said, "but they won't laugh at the cold the same way." His answer was not triumph. It was recognition of a small, hard-won fact. The houses had proved themselves under a demanding teacher, winter. They were still imperfect. They needed tending. But they had changed the ledger of survival. That evening, with stew finished and hands wrapped around small shared mugs, the children slipped outside to play in a soft, compact snow. They crept from the lee of the arched houses to the hollow and back again, their games careful about noise and energy. One of them, Jake, hollowed a small tunnel under a drift and popped up laughing to the astonishment of Clara, who reprimanded him gently for wasting warmth, but could not help smiling. Eliza watched with the practiced softness of someone who measures every breath her family takes. She met Silas's eye and gave him a look that contained no bitterness, only the small, indestructible steadiness that had kept their house going. Silas walked with her after the others had gone to bed, and they stood for a while with their shoulders touching, listening to the world outside, the creak of frozen branches, the far-off clack of a split piece of wood settling in a stack. He felt then a quiet pride that was not showy. It was a private ledger kept in the chest where men keep lessons. They had been mocked, they had been tested, they had been kept by